Well, I think, the longer this conflict continues, and the longer we see Russian aggression, there is a new Iron Curtain, and it stretches from the very north of Norway, the whole way down. It would have gone into the Mediterranean had Russia's position in Syria remained strong, but it now goes down to southern Turkey. That is a massive, massive front. But even in Ukraine, the front is huge. The front line at the minute is about 1,000 kilometers long, a 25-mile buffer zone around that. 25 miles, doing a quick calculation in my head, is about 40 kilometers. So you're talking 40,000 square kilometers of a buffer zone. There's no point in having a buffer zone unless you've got something in it to deter, and something to observe it. And trying to provide observation over 40,000 square kilometers is a significant military task and would take an awful lot more forces than I think the military planners across NATO countries will come up with as something that they can practically provide. Well, it's interesting that Europe's discussing it. I think this is for two reasons. One, to give the military some assumptions to start to plan against, so that they can work out what the bill would be if there was any military need to have an influence into the buffer zone, an influence into Ukraine, should in the unlikely event there be some form of peace agreement. And the second thing is, from a political perspective, to send a political message to Ukraine, and to Vladimir Putin in Russia that Europe is there to support Ukraine, and B, send a further political message to Donald Trump that Europe is thinking about this, and is prepared to step up and do something. However, with all of this, looking at it from a geopolitical perspective at the moment, Russia doesn't want a peace deal. They are a long way off that. And European leaders know that Vladimir Putin doesn't want a peace deal. So they're quite happily writing these political checks, these statements, knowing that the chances of them being asked to cash them in any time soon is very remote indeed. Superficially, both sides will gain, because their people are not dying. It'll give them a chance to reorganize their frontline forces, to re-equip their frontline forces, to further enhance their training and capabilities and all the rest of it. But the side that has most to gain is the side that is winning. And that winning is not necessarily the side that is advancing most, from a tactical perspective on the front line. The Russians are advancing most from a tactical perspective on the front line, but at huge costs. And they're advancing a few hundred meters here, a kilometer there, but then the Ukrainians are pushing them back a few hundred meters, a kilometer, or other things in different parts of the tactical front line. When it comes to the operational front line, I think you look at the tactics of the two sides. The Russians are attacking Ukrainian critical infrastructure, Ukrainian military industrial base, but Ukrainian civilian targets, and trying to break the will of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are still expanding their capability and they're still growing, and it's not impacting their economy because they're supported by the Western economies, and therefore they've got access to a level of financial support that puts Russia into a very, very small basket. Russia is on the brink of beginning to struggle because of the way the Ukrainians are attacking the Russian oil infrastructure, their defense manufacturing infrastructure, their rail infrastructure, which Russians rely on from a logistic perspective. So if that stops, then the Russians have most to gain out of this, because I would say that at that operational level, the Ukrainians are having greatest influence, and therefore, that greatest influence, it's too early to say is leading to them to being in a winning position, but they're certainly control. They certainly have the initiative and are beginning to get a greater control over the overall narrative. Overall, between both sides, it's a stalemate still. Ukraine could benefit quite a lot. However, there's a lot of assumptions in here. A, if there has to be a peace agreement, Vladimir Putin doesn't want it. B, if there's a peace agreement or a ceasefire, then not necessarily NATO troops, because they don't have to come in under a NATO umbrella, but troops from NATO contributing countries are deployed into Ukraine to help the Ukrainians develop their military capability. Putin has said that's unacceptable. Lavrov has said that's unacceptable. So there's a big burden to get over there. But let's assume that for some reason or other, that becomes acceptable and we get our troops in. What it would allow the Ukrainians to do is to redevelop their tactical structures. They have been developing from a more geographically based structure, as I outlined on Battle Plans Exposed, into a core structure which is more Western focused and more maneuverable. But they're in early days of that. So that would let them to develop that. It would let them develop more of their formations with Western equipment and using Western tactics, and let them to develop more layered structures, both from their air defense perspective, their air support, their aviation support, down into the ground structures, so that they're better poised to deal with any threat that develops in the future, and to build their military capability up and build their defense industrial base up in a way that Ukraine then becomes the best deterrent that there is through their military to any further Russian aggression. The Russians, of course, are going to be trying to do the same, but with the backup of the economic might that would come from the West and the defense industrial might that would come from the West, Ukraine could build itself up and develop that much faster than Russia could. And of course, then get a lot of the conscripted soldiers that are up and get them to a higher level of training, so that the casualties, if anything started again, would be reduced enormously. But there are so many hurdles to get over before we get into even the game of taking those assumptions on that I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. NATO and Europe and other countries around the world. Of course, we've got Australia, Japan, and I think New Zealand are part of the International Coalition of the Willing. Would quite happily come together and do this. They've done it before. It's happened in Bosnia under NATO auspices. It's happened in other in Kosovo under NATO auspices. And therefore, this is something that can happen. The real difficulty is when the military planners turn around and work out what tasks would need to be carried out to A, monitor the buffer zone, B, deal with any incursions or any breaches of the buffer zone and all the rest of it. They will calculate the number of troops and the capability of troops that would be needed. And in troops, I include Air Force providing air protection and all the rest of it. And I think whenever the planners come up with the bill, and that goes out to the politicians at the center of this coalition, the willing, they will wince. In fact, they probably will end up crying and will not be able to produce what would be required to provide a robust military capability to deal with the buffer zone and to help support Ukraine. And then you get into the game of what do you cut, what do you not do, where do you take risk, and how do you take what would be a significantly smaller force than the theory would suggest that you need, and you utilize that for best effect. And would there be is the political risk of deploying a force that is inadequate in military terms to do the tasks that you would theoretically want them to do? Are the military risks associated with that politically acceptable or not? And that is a long debate that happens, every time military is deployed. We've never had the troops or the capability that you actually need on paper to carry out the task properly. We got away with it in the Balkans. We didn't get away with it in Iraq, and we didn't get away with it in Afghanistan. Article 5 style protections are enough to act as a deterrent if they're backed up with real practicalities. The difficulty is, Article 5 is not, as people automatically interpret it, as one side gets attacked or one country gets attacked, and then everyone will come in with all of their military capability and help defend it. Article 5 says that if one side gets attacked, all other countries will support them. Now, that support can be defined in different ways. It could be you get a there we are, we support you enormously, but you get a nice letter of support saying we support you. We're going to call the Russian ambassador in and condemn it, right through to military capability. And everyone hopes, and the military planners hope, and the military staffs get together and work on the assumption that it will provide all the military capability that's needed. But assumption is the mother of all things going wrong. There is another phrase that I could put in, but I'll not put it, not put it, record it. And too many assumptions are made, and therefore you then get into the heavy negotiations of what's needed. Of course, there was an Article 5, sort of, if you wanted to interpret the Budapest memorandums whenever Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, and that was signed up to by, Russia, the United States, the United Kingdom, and others, and that said that they would protect and give security guarantees to Ukraine. The Russians invaded Ukraine, and the UK, US, and others didn't step up. So, that's the game that we're in from a geopolitical perspective. The Iron Curtain dominated a large part of my early military career, and I was deployed in Germany a lot, being ready for Russian incursion across the Iron Curtain and attacks into Germany and Northwest Europe. What the Iron Curtain did was it gave the ability for the West to bankrupt the Soviet Union, and that's how we won, because every time the Soviet Union produced a new piece of equipment, it cost them about 5 times or more the amount that it cost the West to produce something that would defeat it. And as soon as it was defeated, the Russians or the Soviet Union would try and develop something else that they could use to try and defeat the Western technology. And it became this war of economics. And that war of economics is something that broke the Soviet Union. But how many decades did it take to do that? An awful lot of decades to do it. And Russia is in a slightly different position at the moment economically. The USSR it was huge, but didn't have the sort of economic alliances that Russia's got. You were seeing Russia, you're backed by China, part of the BRICS community, which has got a massive population around the world. And therefore, it's in a position potentially to economically survive and gain access to higher levels of technology at a much better cost than it did during the previous Cold War. So, if the last Cold War lasted a number of decades, I think any new Cold War would last tens of decades, if not more, and polarize the world even more than it was polarized beforehand. A ceasefire in Ukraine would not lead Russia to a more peaceful future, with the current leadership and those that would come and step in Russia's position in the world, because those that would step in are the architects of the special military operation, and some of them are more hardline than Putin. So, and the Russians and Putin think in generational terms. So they don't care what Donald Trump's going to do because they know he's gone in 4 years' time. They're looking at Donald Trump's successor and his successor's successor, and that's what they'll be thinking in. So they will always have the ambition to grow Russia into the old Soviet Union again, as they're trying to do, and they will come back if there's a ceasefire in Ukraine, especially if they're allowed to keep some territory. They will come back at some stage in the future and try and take another bite out of Ukraine, and possibly take another bite out of somewhere else. In Ukraine, it would be to try and take a bite out to get the whole of the Black Sea coastline, to try and then link up with the separatist area of Transnistria in Moldova, and then they would take their next steps from there. But they don't mind waiting 10, 15, 20 years to achieve that, whereas the West is thinking of when the midterms are going to be, or when the next local elections are going to be, or when the next general elections are going to be. And therefore, our politicians that are making decisions today aren't necessarily thinking about the long-term implications of what it is that they're deciding.